I think about the difference in people's cognitive models and how I think that affects what you're interested in, how you learn, because it ties to the gears thing. I mean, I think that when I was little, I just didn't like disciplines. I wanted to create one big model of the world, and I was really into grand theory. So I didn't like having a math class and a physics class and a history class. I wanted to understand why this history lesson had something to do. What does it mean for my physics model? And it took me a lot longer to become smart. Like I had bad grades, I didn't get stuff because I didn't want to build a history model and a social science model and stuff like that. I think and this is why I needed to learn things intuitively, was I wanted to translate what was going on in the teacher's mind and adapt it to my own kludged together, Joey's customized version of a cognitive model. In later years, and I'm just making this up, this may or may not be true, but I think that now I have an ability to connect things together better because now I only have one cognitive model. So when I hear a history talk, I can talk about the relevance to my physics researcher because I can translate it through my model, because I map it onto a single model. Whereas I find when somebody is in a discipline, it's very difficult for two disciplines to talk to each other because their cognitive models actually don't have a hard time connecting because the patterns are so different. And so for me, it took me longer to build this funky thing. And partially it was what Mimi was saying, was being bicultural. I didn't want to build a separate America model and a separate Japan model. I was trying to pull them together and create a single bicultural model. And I don't know if you call it a cognitive model, but it's kind of a worldview thing. Whereas I think some people can be quite structured and have the disciplines, but then have the way to connect those blocks together in kind of a metastructure. So you can go through the world, the life, and build a pyramid, and then come up with profound thoughts. But my brain was just not structured in a way that it could be structured. It was just kind of this chaotic thing that was coming out of this need to be able to understand things intuitively and translate them in my own way. And part of it, I think, came from like I realized like I didn't think in words, I didn't think in numbers, I thought in kind of forces. So everything felt kind of physical. That's why these dangling bonds and keys, there were always these little physical metaphors, and I always had to map it into that, and it was difficult because the teachers didn't explain things to me and those sorts of things. So I think part of it is like what is the media form that's good for you? How do you store it? How do you think about it? And how do you translate it out? Determines what sorts of things. And to use the word inspiration, I mean, it is the interest because you can find a lecture interesting to you if it fits a model that you can understand. But if it seems irrelevant to you, you're not interested. So this is a slightly different use of the word interest. But I think what you find interesting depends a little bit on the cognitive model that you're building. And I think that Mimi and I had very different ways of processing and storing and collecting that information.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're pointing to is, something that I think learning scientists have recognized, and there's more and more good research on, is the fact that when learning is embedded within an experiential, hands-on, and relevant real-world frame, it's much more resilient and effective and motivating. It's not surprising, right? I mean, talking about intuitive, it's not surprising that learning's more fun when it's relevant and experiential. So, and I think that there's a small number of people who, and I may be one of them, who have that more formal academic orientation to learning, where a certain level of abstraction is actually the cognitive model that works. And, my colleague Howard Gardner has given me this language about lumpers and splitters, people who like to make distinctions and categorize. And it's a particular kind of, versus people who are always drawing connections. And, it's a particular kind of mindset, I think, which is very, very valuable for school-based learning and has served me well within the formal academic environment, is, being able to think in a fairly formal, structured way. I don't think that is necessarily experiential or natural for everybody. And I think school rewards, those people who can compartmentalize and divide things up in that way. But we know from working with young people that that's not motivating for a lot of kids to learn in that way. And, even for those of us who are more academic and formal thinkers, when we can apply those frameworks and those disciplines to things that are relevant to our real lives, it becomes so much more interesting. And, the only reason why I've stayed in academia is because I've been able to build those connections to things that are meaningful in my real life. And so, the question to me is not so much how can we change schools and classrooms, but really, how can we bring them into the world in ways that are building on experience. And I think the best forms of learning and instruction are already doing that.
I want to interject the idea of technology into here, which we actually haven't been talking about very much. But for me, at least, when we talk about learning from experience, these are relatively old ideas. John Dewey was writing about these ideas 100 years ago. For me, I'd like to think that one of the challenges with Dewey's progressive schools is that there's a limited range of things you can do from experience. If you have a set of things that you think it's important for people to engage with, things for people to know, with traditional media, there might be some things that you can easily investigate through experience, but other things are very difficult, especially things that are dynamic and interactive. If all you have are crayons and wooden blocks, it's hard to do it in an experiential way. So I think the hope would be that technologies could open up and give a greater chance to support more experiential approaches to a greater range of learning experiences. I don't know if either of you have anything to say about that.
Well, I'll just use the World of Warcraft as an example. I mean, I think if you have a 5-year-old leading a raid over TeamSpeak or wherever of 40 adults, and to use John Seeley Brown's word, I mean, and you hit that moment of ensemble where everything comes together and you take down the boss, and everybody cheers. That's a real experience of leadership that a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old would never get. Yep. Not only with crayons and blocks at school, right? Yep. And so that's a tremendously important experience to have early, because you start to understand what real leadership is about and how it's an emergent thing and and about meritocracy. So I think the social component of experience is tremendously enabled, and also the other part is just to be able to be a creator, right? So good science and technology right now is stuff that you can hack. Right? And I think that we've gone through a whole period where, as a kid, in the old days, you could hack bugs and plants and nature. You couldn't hack all the toys that you had and the wooden blocks and the crayons, but now you can hack stuff. And so I think it's the social component, it's the hacking component, and then the ability to learn on your own without this formal instruction. I mean, you could do this again with wooden blocks, but I think it's tremendously empowering to be able to do that as a child, because then you become fearless at that level.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree that it's sort of the hackability, remixability component, the abundance of social connection, right, and the low barriers to entry for a lot of interest activities that the internet provides. I would just add one more, which is the tremendous diversification of access to interests that young people have at an early age. So the previous comment, it's like you don't just have to do piano, math, history, that there's sort of a limited number of interests that most local communities can provide in their learning interest in community environments, and the internet just blows that wide open. So you don't have to do football, baseball, basketball. Suddenly you have badminton and you have surfing. It's as if for knowledge and interest-based things, you suddenly have access to a ton of interests that are not offered necessarily within your school. And that is a huge game changer, because I think it's just, physically impossible for purely place-based institutions to offer that kind of diversity and specialization.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And I do think maybe that's a good note for us to end on, but this idea of just opening up these wider range, connecting to a much wider range of interests. So if the session's all about interest-based learning, there's an opportunity to be able to support and connect to this much wider range of interests and to connect with other people with those interests, or other types of information that can support resources to help you develop those interests. I think it's sort of a key to having a renaissance in interest-based learning. Although it's not a new idea, I think we're now in a place where we can have a real renaissance in it.